My stepmother took everything from me: the house, the money, the family business. But she never imagined that soon she would lose it all. You know how they say life has a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it? Well, let me tell you about the time I learned that lesson the hard way. Picture this: small-town America, where everyone knows everyone, and your biggest worry is whether the local diner will run out of apple pie on Sunday. That was my world at 25. Simple, predictable, safe. I remember those days like they happened yesterday. My life ran like a perfectly tuned engine. Smooth, steady, no surprises. There was something beautiful about the routine, you know? Wake up at 6 a.m., coffee black as motor oil, then head to the family auto shop that had been in our bloodline for 3 generations. The smell of grease and metal wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was the perfume of my heritage. My old man used to say it all the time, almost like a broken record. "This will all be yours someday, son." He'd gesture around the shop with those weathered hands that had fixed more engines than I could count. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? The man had never lied to me about anything else. Every bolt I turned, every engine I rebuilt, every satisfied customer who walked out our door, all felt like I was building something permanent, something that would outlast me. The house we lived in told the same story. Big Victorian-style place my grandfather had built back in the day, complete with wraparound porch and enough rooms to house a small army. After Mom passed when I was 17, it became our fortress, just me and Dad against the world. The walls held memories of Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings, and countless evenings where Dad would share his philosophy about life over a beer on the back porch. "Honesty, son, is the best lubricant for any machine," he'd tell me, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. I was young enough to think that wisdom like that could protect you from anything. Little did I know that the most dangerous breakdowns happen in the parts you never think to check. Our auto shop wasn't just a business. It was a heartbeat of our little community. Farmers brought their tractors. Soccer moms brought their minivans. Teenagers brought their first cars, hoping we could work miracles on their tight budgets. We treated everyone the same: fair prices, honest work, and a handshake that meant something. Dad had built a reputation that was solid as bedrock, and I was proud to be part of that legacy. I remember the rhythm of those days. The morning ritual of checking which cars needed attention. The satisfaction of diagnosing a tricky problem. The simple pleasure of seeing relief on a customer's face when we told them the fix wouldn't break the bank. It was honest work that left me tired but fulfilled at the end of each day. I thought I had life figured out. Then she appeared. Laura. Even now, saying that name feels like biting into something sour. She slithered into our lives like a snake in Eden, all polished exterior and calculated charm. The woman looked like she'd stepped off a billboard. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people made in a month, and a smile that could sell ice to Eskimos. But her eyes? Those eyes told a different story entirely. They were the kind of cold blue that reminded you of winter mornings when the frost kills everything green. She wasn't looking at you when she talked. She was calculating, measuring, appraising. Dad met her at some community function, a charity dinner for the volunteer fire department. If I remember right, he came home that night with a dopey grin that I hadn't seen since Mom was alive. At first, I was happy for him. The man had been alone for 8 years, and if he found someone who could bring back that spark, well, more power to him. The first dinner she came to our house should have been a warning sign. Dad had spent the entire day cleaning, cooking, setting the table like we were expecting royalty. He was nervous as a teenager on his first date, adjusting his tie every 5 minutes and asking me if everything looked okay. When Laura walked through our front door, she didn't just enter, she surveyed. I watched her eyes catalog every piece of furniture, every family photo, every detail of our home like she was conducting an inventory. She complimented Dad's cooking, but I noticed she barely touched her food. Instead, she asked questions. Lots of questions. About the house, about the business, about our family history. I tried to lighten the mood with some automotive humor. You know, the kind of jokes that usually got at least a chuckle from our customers. Something about lawyers and mechanics both dealing with people's problems. Except mechanics actually fix things. The silence hit harder than a wrench to the gut. Her smile didn't reach those calculating eyes, and I felt my own grin die right there on my face. Dad, bless his heart, laughed loud enough for both of them and quickly changed the subject. But I caught the look she gave me when he wasn't watching. The kind of look a cat gives a mouse before deciding whether it's worth the effort to pounce. Then she brought her son around. Blake, same age as me, but you could tell he'd never done a day of real work in his life. His hands were softer than a baby's bottom, and he wore clothes that probably cost more than what most folks in our town made in a week. The kid looked at our auto shop like it was a sewage treatment plant, wrinkling his nose at the honest smell of motor oil and hard work. Auto repair? That's so blue collar, he said, managing to make it sound like a disease. I wanted to tell him that blue collar work built this country, that there was honor in fixing things instead of just talking about them. But Dad was standing right there beaming like Blake had just discovered the cure for cancer. The worst part? Dad ate it up. He saw Blake as some kind of gift from heaven, a well-educated young man who could bring fresh perspectives to the family business. Fresh perspectives. Right, like a vegetarian bringing fresh perspectives to a barbecue joint. Love is blind, I thought to myself. But my dad apparently needs a hearing aid too, because he can't hear the ice cracking under his feet. But I kept my mouth shut. What else could I do? The man had raised me, taught me everything I knew about life and work. If this woman made him happy, who was I to rain on his parade? Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I was seeing monsters where there were only shadows. The wedding happened faster than a NASCAR pit stop. 6 months from the first dinner to walking down the aisle. Looking back, that should have been another red flag, but Dad was in full romantic mode. He'd hum while he worked, buy flowers for no reason, and generally act like a man half his age who just discovered love for the first time. Laura moved into our house, our fortress, and things started changing. Small things at first, like rearranging the furniture or suggesting we needed new curtains. Then came the rules. Put your coffee cup here, not there. Don't leave your boots by the door. Wipe down the counters this way, not that way. Each suggestion was delivered with a sweet smile and couched in terms of improvement or organization. But every change felt like another small piece of my life being erased, another tradition being swept away in the name of progress. I tried to push back, gently at first. This was my home too. After all, I'd grown up in these rooms, learned to walk on these floors, spent countless evenings doing homework at that kitchen table. But every time I objected, Dad would give me the same speech about respecting Laura, about her being part of the family now, about how I needed to make an effort. Adam, she's your stepmother now. Show some respect, he'd say, and those words cut deeper than any tool in our shop. It wasn't just about the coffee cups or the curtains. It was about watching my father hand over his moral compass to someone who clearly had her own agenda. The house that had been my sanctuary was becoming foreign territory. I'd walk through rooms that looked the same but felt different, like someone had changed the frequency, and everything was slightly off tune. The family photos got moved to less prominent spots, replaced by Laura's tasteful art pieces. Our old, comfortable furniture got upgraded to stuff that looked fancy but felt like punishment. I started spending more time at the shop, finding reasons to work late or come in early. At least there, surrounded by the honest smell of motor oil and the familiar rhythm of real work, I could still feel like myself. But even that refuge wasn't safe for long. Laura started showing up at the shop, always with some excuse, bringing Dad lunch, picking him up for a doctor's appointment, or just checking in. But I noticed how her eyes moved around the place, taking inventory again, asking questions about our customers, our income, our business practices. I could help with the bookkeeping, she offered one day, her voice dripping with helpfulness. I am a lawyer, after all. I know about financial organization. Dad thought it was a wonderful idea. Of course he did. Here was his brilliant new wife offering to help improve the business. What could go wrong? I wanted to tell him that the books were fine, that we'd been managing just fine for 3 generations without her help, that some things were better left alone. But I could see the writing on the wall. In Dad's eyes, Laura could do no wrong. She was the answer to problems he didn't even know he had. The final straw came when I realized I was becoming a stranger in my own life. Every conversation felt monitored, every decision questioned, every tradition challenged. I was walking on eggshells in a house where I'd learned to walk, period. That night, I overheard Laura talking on the phone. I don't know who she was speaking to, but I heard her say clearly, "He'll be gone soon anyway." That did it for me. One evening after that, following another family dinner where I felt like an unwelcome guest, I made a decision that hurt like pulling out a splinter the size of a railroad spike. "Dad, I think I should move out," I told him. "Give you and Laura some space to build your new life together." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. This wasn't how I'd imagined my life going. I was supposed to inherit this house, this business, this legacy. Instead, I was voluntarily exiling myself from my own kingdom. Dad looked surprised and hurt, then resigned. "If that's what you think is best, son," he said, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice. He thought I was being difficult, that I couldn't accept change, that I was somehow failing to embrace this new chapter of his life. What he didn't understand was that I felt like I was being slowly erased, edited out of the story that I'd helped write for 25 years. Laura wasn't just changing the furniture. She was rewriting the entire narrative of our family, and there didn't seem to be room for me in the new version. I found a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and think and figure out what the hell had happened to my life. Moving out of the house where I'd grown up felt like leaving a piece of my soul behind, but staying would have meant watching myself disappear completely. This is just temporary, I told myself as I packed my few belongings. Dad will come to his senses. He'll see what she's really like. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. I was watching my father hand over everything we built together to a woman who saw dollar signs where he saw love, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. As I drove away from the house that last night, I caught a glimpse of Laura watching from the upstairs window. Even from that distance, I could see her smile, not the sweet, artificial one she wore around Dad, but something colder, more satisfied, like a chess player who just put her opponent in checkmate. I didn't know it then, but that smile would haunt me for months to come. It was a smile of someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted, and I was just beginning to understand how thoroughly I'd been outplayed. The worst part wasn't losing my home or feeling like a stranger in my own family. The worst part was watching the man who taught me about honesty and integrity get taken in by someone who embodied everything he'd raised me to recognize and avoid. Sometimes the biggest betrayals come from the people you'd never suspect. I thought as I unpacked in my new, empty apartment. Dad wasn't betraying me intentionally. He was just a good man who couldn't imagine that someone could look at him and see opportunity instead of love. But Laura, she knew exactly what she was doing. And I had a terrible feeling that this was just the beginning. Little did I know how right I was. Moving out didn't solve anything. It just gave me a front row seat to watch my life get dismantled piece by piece. I kept working at the shop. Hell, what else was I going to do? But something fundamental had shifted. The place that used to feel like home now felt like I was visiting someone else's dream. Dad started showing up less and less. The man who used to be first in, last out, who could diagnose engine problems in his sleep, suddenly became a part-timer in his own business. Every time I asked him about it, he'd wave me off with the same excuse about his health not being what it used to be. But I could see Laura in the background, that subtle smile playing on her lips like she just won a hand of poker nobody else knew they were playing. Meanwhile, she practically moved into the office. Laura was there every day, hovering around like a vulture, circling roadkill. She'd say she was helping with the bookkeeping, organizing files, bringing some much-needed legal perspective to our operations. Her voice was honey-sweet when she explained how she was just trying to help, but her eyes were surgical steel, cutting through our business with precision that made my skin crawl. The woman who'd never changed a tire in her life was suddenly giving advice to mechanics who'd been turning wrenches since before she was born. She'd walk through the shop in her pristine heels, pointing out inefficiencies and suggesting improvements with the confidence of someone who'd built the place from the ground up. The guys started looking at me with questions in their eyes, questions I couldn't answer because I was asking myself the same damn things. "I'm just trying to bring some order to things, Adam," she'd tell me whenever I questioned her presence. "You know how I love organization. The way she said my name made it sound like she was discussing a problem that needed solving. Every invoice she reviewed, every supplier she contacted, every customer interaction she observed, all felt like she was mapping out territory for a hostile takeover. I started noticing changes in how we did business. Suddenly, we were charging diagnostic fees that we'd never charged before. Parts that we used to get at cost were now marked up significantly. Customer loyalty programs that Dad had maintained for decades were quietly discontinued. When I brought these concerns to him, he'd just shrug and say Laura knew about business law, that maybe we'd been too generous for our own good. Watching my father's life's work get rewritten by someone who saw dollar signs where he saw relationships was like watching a master painting get painted over by someone with no respect for the original art. Then came the phone call that changed everything. I was under the hood of a '98 Chevy, fighting with a stubborn alternator, when my phone rang. Unknown number, which usually meant either a telemarketer or someone with car trouble. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Adam?" The voice was professional, clinical. "This is Dr. Martinez from General Hospital. I'm calling about your father." The wrench slipped from my hand and clattered to the concrete floor. Everything after that felt like it was happening underwater, muffled and surreal. Heart attack. Sudden. Didn't make it. "I'm sorry for your loss." I drove to the hospital in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. When I got there, Laura was already in the waiting room, sitting composed and dry-eyed while talking to a doctor. She looked up when I walked in, and for just a split second, I swear I saw something that wasn't grief flash across her face. Relief maybe? Satisfaction? But then she was hugging me, playing the part of the devastated stepmother, and I wondered if I was losing my mind along with everything else. Grief does funny things to your head, makes you see conspiracies where there might just be coincidences. The funeral was a blur of handshakes and condolences from people who'd known Dad their whole lives. Everyone had a story about how he'd helped them out, fixed their car for next to nothing, or extended credit when times were tight. I stood there listening to these testimonials to my father's character and felt proud and heartbroken at the same time. Laura played the grieving widow perfectly. Black dress, appropriate tears, gracious acceptance of sympathy. She thanked everyone for coming, promised that the shop would continue to serve the community just as my father would have wanted. The performance was so convincing that I almost bought it myself. But I kept thinking about that overheard phone conversation. He'll be gone soon anyway. Had she been talking about me? Or had she somehow known something about Dad's health that the rest of us didn't? The thought made my stomach turn, but grief and paranoia aren't easily separated when your world is falling apart. The week after the funeral was the longest of my life. Every day felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew Dad had a will. He'd mentioned it a few times over the years, always in the context of making sure I'd be taken care of. I'd never asked for details because talking about death felt like inviting bad luck, but I assumed he'd done right by me. I kept telling myself that everything would make sense once the lawyer read the will. Dad wasn't the kind of man to forget his son, especially when it came to the business we'd built together. He'd taught me everything he knew, groomed me to take over, promised me that legacy countless times. Maybe Dad thought giving Laura control would unburden me. Maybe she convinced him I wasn't ready yet. Or maybe she just got to him when he was too tired to argue. The reading was scheduled for the following Monday at 2 p.m. in the office of Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled Dad's affairs for decades. I showed up 15 minutes early, partly out of nervousness and partly because punctuality had been drilled into me since childhood. Laura arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservative gray suit that made her look every inch the successful attorney she was. Mr. Hartwell was an older gentleman who'd probably been practicing law since before I was born. He offered his condolences, made some small talk about what a good man my father had been, then got down to business with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. I sat on the edge of my chair, hands clenched in my lap, waiting for the words that would secure my future and validate everything Dad had taught me about family and legacy. The reading started with the usual legal language about sound mind and last testament, but I barely heard any of it. I was focused on the part that mattered. Who got what? When Hartwell got to the meat of the document, His voice took on a different tone, more careful, more apologetic. The house, all financial assets, and the automotive repair business known as Thompson's Auto Service were to be transferred in their entirety to Laura Thompson, née Mitchell, beloved wife of the deceased. I felt like I'd been sucker punched by a hydraulic press. The air left my lungs in a rush, and for a moment, I couldn't process what I'd heard. There had to be a mistake. Dad wouldn't have done this. He couldn't have done this. But Hartwell kept reading, explaining that the will had been updated just 3 months prior, and that all properties had been restructured as joint ownership with rights of survivorship. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly binding, and perfectly devastating. I looked at Laura, and she was looking right back at me with an expression that was almost pitying, almost. But underneath that mask of appropriate solemnity, I could see something else, the satisfied look of a chess player who just announced checkmate. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. The shop, Dad always said. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Your father was very clear about his intentions, Adam. He felt that Laura, with her legal background and business acumen, would be better positioned to manage the transition and ensure the continued success of the enterprise. Enterprise, not family business, not legacy. Enterprise, like we were some corporate entity instead of 3 generations of Thompsons who'd built something meaningful with their bare hands. Laura reached across the table and put her hand on mine in what probably looked like a gesture of comfort to anyone watching. Her skin was cold, her grip firm, and when she spoke, her voice carried just the right amount of sympathy. Adam, I hope you know that nothing has to change dramatically. You're still family, and there will always be a place for you at the shop. A place for me. At the shop my grandfather had started. The shop my father had expanded. The shop where I'd learned to work with my hands and take pride in honest labor. She was offering me a job of my own inheritance, like she was doing me a favor. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to demand answers about how this had happened. But I was in shock, the kind of numbness that comes when your entire understanding of reality gets rearranged without warning. I just sat there, nodding like a bobblehead, trying to process the fact that I'd been completely outmaneuvered by someone who'd been planning this since the day she met my father. The meeting ended with paperwork and signatures and legal procedures that felt like watching someone else's life implode. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been erased from my own story, written out of the narrative I thought I was helping to create. That night, I sat in my small apartment staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how I'd missed all the signs. Dad updating his will, the sudden interest in the business, the way Laura had systematically inserted herself into every aspect of our operation. It had all been so gradual, so reasonable sounding at each step, that I'd never seen the bigger picture until it was too late. But the worst part wasn't the money or even the business. The worst part was realizing that my father, the man who taught me about integrity and family values, had been manipulated into betraying everything he'd raised me to believe in. Laura hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She corrupted my father's legacy in the process. I went back to work the next day because I didn't know what else to do. The shop looked the same, smelled the same, but everything felt different now that I knew I was just an employee in what used to be my birthright. Then Blake showed up. Laura's precious son arrived like he was claiming a conquered territory, walking through the shop with the confidence of someone who'd never had to work for anything in his life. The mechanics watched him with barely concealed disgust as he pointed out things that needed to be optimized and modernized. His first official act as the new manager was to call a staff meeting. He stood in front of the guys who'd been working there longer than he'd been alive and laid out his vision for the future. Higher prices across the board. Aggressive upselling on every job. Maximum profit extraction from every customer interaction. We're not running a charity here, he announced with the smugness of someone who just discovered the concept of capitalism. Every customer who walks through that door is a revenue opportunity, and I expect you all to treat them as such. I watched the faces of the mechanics during this speech. Guys like Charlie, who'd been with us for 15 years, and Martinez, who'd learned his trade from my father. They looked sick. These were men who took pride in honest work, who'd built relationships with customers over decades, who understood that reputation was worth more than any quick profit. But Blake wasn't done. He pulled out a folder full of new pricing structures and commission schedules, explaining how bonuses would be tied to individual sales performance rather than customer satisfaction. The whole thing was designed to turn our repair shop into some kind of predatory sales operation. Any questions? Blake asked, looking around the room like a general addressing troops before battle. Charlie raised his hand slowly. What about the customers who've been coming here for 20 years? Folks who trust us to be straight with them? Blake's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Charlie, is it? Those customers will adapt or find somewhere else to go. Business is about evolution, not nostalgia. That's when I knew for certain that everything I had valued about our family business was going to be systematically destroyed. Blake wasn't interested in maintaining what we'd built. He wanted to strip mine it for maximum short-term profit and move on to the next opportunity. The changes started immediately. Diagnostic fees for problems that took 5 minutes to identify. Parts markups that would make a highway robbery seem reasonable. Labor charges that bore no relationship to the actual work performed. Within a week, we were getting complaints from customers who'd been coming to us for decades. Mrs. Peterson, whose late husband had bought every car from us since 1987, called to ask why our oil change had suddenly doubled in price. Bob Martinez, who'd helped build half the houses in town, wanted to know when we'd started charging for estimates. These were people who trusted us with their vehicles because they knew we'd treat them fairly. I tried to maintain some semblance of the old standards, but Blake was watching everything I did with the intensity of a hawk circling prey. Every job I completed was scrutinized, every customer interaction monitored. If I didn't hit the new pricing targets, I got a lecture about being a team player and adapting to modern business practices. The worst part was watching good customers walk away. People who'd been loyal to the Thompson name for generations were finding other places to take their cars because they couldn't afford what we were charging or didn't trust what we become. I wanted to apologize to every single one of them, to explain that this wasn't what my father would have wanted, but I was trapped between my conscience and my need to keep my job. Every day at work became an exercise in moral compromise. I'd quote a price I knew was too high for a repair I could do for half the cost, all while looking into the eyes of neighbors who'd known me since I was a kid. It felt like betraying everything my father had taught me about treating people with respect and dignity. Blake seemed to take special pleasure in undermining me in front of the other workers. He'd contradict my recommendations, question my methods, and generally make it clear that my opinions were neither wanted nor valued. The message was obvious. I was being systematically pushed toward the exit door. Every interaction became a test of my willingness to compromise my principles. He'd hover over me during customer consultations, making sure I followed the new pricing protocols. When I tried to explain that honest pricing built long-term customer loyalty, he'd cut me off with lectures about quarterly profits and market efficiency. The atmosphere in the shop became toxic. Guys who worked together for years started avoiding eye contact. Everyone could feel the tension, the way the whole operation was being twisted into something ugly. We went from being a team that took pride in our work to a collection of individuals just trying to survive another day without getting fired. I started having trouble sleeping. Every night, I'd lie awake thinking about what my father would say if he could see what his business had become. The man who taught me that a handshake was worth more than any contract would be horrified by the predatory operation his shop had transformed into. The hardest part was maintaining any sense of professional integrity while working under Blake's new system. Every customer interaction became a moral minefield. Do I charge them what Blake demands and betray everything I believe in, or do I stick to my principles and risk getting fired? The writing was on the wall. The only question was how long I could maintain this impossible balance before something had to give. My days at Thompson's Auto Service were numbered, and we all knew it. I just had to wait for Blake to find the excuse he was obviously looking for to get rid of me once and for all. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. Nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. I was going through the motions at work, trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity, while Blake breathed down my neck like a parole officer. Every customer interaction felt like walking through a minefield. knowing that one wrong step would give him the excuse he was looking for. That morning had been particularly brutal. Blake had called another one of his optimization meetings, where he lectured us about profit margins and customer conversion rates like we were selling used cars instead of fixing them. The guys looked like they wanted to crawl under the nearest vehicle and hide until this nightmare was over. I was working on a transmission rebuild, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of honest work, when I heard an engine that sounded older than dirt pulling into our lot. Looking up from the hood, I saw something that felt like a breath of fresh air in our increasingly toxic workplace, an old Ford pickup that had clearly been loved and maintained by someone who understood what it meant to take care of things. The truck was probably from the early 80s, forest green with just enough rust to give it character without looking neglected. It had the kind of honest where that comes from decades of real work, not the artificial distressing you see on vehicles driven by people who want to look rugged without ever hauling anything heavier than groceries. The driver who stepped out looked like he'd stepped straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Older guy, maybe 70s, wearing a faded army jacket that had seen better decades, but was still clean and pressed. His face had the kind of lines that come from smiling more than frowning, and his eyes held the clarity of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know what actually mattered. But what really caught my attention was his passenger. Sitting in the front seat like he owned the place was the biggest, most dignified Labrador I'd ever seen. Golden coat, graying around the muzzle, with intelligent eyes that seemed to be taking in everything. The dog didn't jump out or get excited. He just sat there with the patience of someone who'd been on a lot of road trips and knew the routine. The old man walked over with the steady gait of someone who'd learned to pace himself for the long haul. When he spoke, his voice had that particular quality that comes from years of being listened to, not loud, but carrying enough authority that you paid attention. "Son," he said, "my truck's been acting up, engine's running rough, and I've still got a ways to go to get home to the farm." I noticed him glance back at his patient companion and couldn't help but comment, "That's a beautiful dog you've got there. So well-behaved, just sitting there like he owns the place." The old man's face lit up with genuine pride. "He's family, and I don't go anywhere without him. Think you could take a look at what's wrong with my truck." There was something about this guy that immediately set him apart from our usual customers. Maybe it was the way he treated his dog like an equal partner rather than a pet, or the fact that he called me son without making it sound condescending. Whatever it was, I felt myself responding to genuine human decency for the first time in weeks. I popped the hood and started going through the usual diagnostics. The engine bay was clean, not showroom clean, but maintained by someone who understood that prevention was worth more than any cure. As I worked, I could feel the old man watching, not hovering or asking annoying questions, just observing with the patience of someone who'd learned that good work takes time. It didn't take long to find the problem. A simple electrical connector had worked itself loose, probably from normal vibration over thousands of miles. 5 seconds with a screwdriver, and the engine was purring like it was 20 years younger. "Well, that was easy," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Just a loose connection. Happens all the time on these older trucks." The relief on his face was immediate and genuine. "How much do I owe you, son?" Here's where things get interesting. According to Blake's new pricing structure, I was supposed to charge for a full diagnostic, minimum labor charges, and probably try to upsell him on preventive maintenance he didn't need. The old me would have done exactly that, following the rules because that's what you did. But looking at this old timer and his faithful dog, I couldn't do it. This wasn't work. This was just basic human kindness, helping a neighbor, being the kind of person my father had raised me to be. "No charge," I said, closing the hood. Wasn't even really a repair, just tightening something that came loose. Have a safe trip home. The smile that spread across his weathered face was worth more than any commission Blake could have offered. He introduced himself as John, shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that comes from a lifetime of real work, and promised to bring me some honey for his beehives the next time he was in town. Small acts of kindness are like sparks in the darkness, I thought as I watched him drive away. They light up both the giver and the receiver. Little did I know how prophetic that moment would prove to be. I was still feeling good about the interaction, when I noticed Blake and Laura watching from the office window. Their expressions reminded me of vultures sizing up roadkill, and I realized my moment of human decency was about to become my professional execution. The ambush came as soon as I walked back into the shop. They were waiting for me like prosecutors at a war crimes trial, and I knew immediately that my fate had been sealed before I even opened my mouth. Laura's voice could have frozen antifreeze. "Where's the work order for that truck? What did you charge him?" I tried to explain that there hadn't been any actual work involved, just a 30-second adjustment that anyone could have done, but they weren't interested in logic or reason. They wanted blood, and I had just given them the perfect excuse to draw it. Blake jumped in with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. "You just gave away services for free. Do you have any idea what that does to our profit margins? This is exactly the kind of thinking that's been holding this place back." The lecture that followed was like being trapped in a corporate seminar designed by people who'd never turned a wrench in their lives. They talked about revenue optimization, customer value extraction, and maximizing every transaction like we were running some kind of financial services company instead of fixing trucks for working people. I tried to defend myself, explaining that customer goodwill was worth more than nickel and diming every person who walked through our door, but they weren't hearing any of it. In their world, everything was a transaction. Every interaction was a profit opportunity, and my father's philosophy of treating people right was just naive sentimentality. Then Laura delivered the killing blow, her words dripping with the kind of venom that only comes from years of practice in courtrooms. "You know what, Adam? Your father's honesty didn't get him very far, did it? You're following right in his footsteps, and we can all see where that's leading you." The disrespect in her voice when she mentioned my dad was like a physical slap. This woman who'd married him for his assets was now using his memory as a weapon against his son. The rage that had been building up for months finally found its target. I don't remember exactly what I said in response, but it was loud, it was angry, and it probably included some words that would make a sailor blush. All the frustration of watching my family's business get corrupted, all the pain of being treated like an outsider in my own inheritance, all the disgust of seeing everything my father had built get twisted into something ugly, it all came pouring out at once. Laura didn't try to argue or defend herself. She just waited for my outburst to run its course, then delivered her verdict with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this moment for a long time. "That's it. You're fired. Clean out your locker and get off this property. I don't want to see you here again." Just like that, it was over. 30 seconds of human decency toward an old veteran had given them the excuse they needed to cut me loose from my own family's legacy. I was being exiled from the business my grandfather had started, the shop my father had expanded, the career I'd been preparing for since I was old enough to hold a wrench. The walk to my locker felt like a death march. The other mechanics watched with expressions that mixed sympathy with relief that they weren't the ones getting the axe. Charlie, who'd worked with my dad for 15 years, looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't risk his own job by showing solidarity with condemned. I packed my personal tools into a cardboard box, not much to show for years of learning the trade, and building relationships with customers who trusted me with their vehicles. A few family photos, some spare work clothes, and the pocket knife my father had given me on my 16th birthday. Everything else would stay behind, property of the new regime. Walking out of Thompson's auto service for the last time felt surreal. This place had been my second home, my training ground, my expected future. Now it was just another workplace that had chewed me up and spit me out for having the audacity to treat people with basic human decency. The next week was a blur of job applications and rejection letters. Our small town didn't exactly have a booming automotive industry, and word travels fast in close-knit communities. Somehow, everyone seemed to know that I'd been fired from the family business, though the details of why remained mysteriously vague. I started questioning everything about my approach to life. Maybe Blake was right. Maybe treating people fairly was just naive idealism that had no place in the real world. Maybe my father's philosophy about honesty being the best policy was just small-town wisdom that couldn't survive in a competitive marketplace. The rent was due in 3 days, and my savings account was looking about as healthy as a car with a blown engine. I'd applied everywhere that might need some of my mechanical skills, other repair shops, the local dealership, even a tire store. But nobody was hiring, or nobody wanted to hire someone who'd been let go from their own family's business. I found myself sitting in my apartment on a Wednesday evening, staring at a stack of unpaid bills and wondering if this was what rock bottom felt like. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sound of traffic outside and the hum of my neighbor's television through the thin walls. For the first time since all this started, I allowed myself to really think about what I'd lost. Not just the job or the money, but the identity I'd built around being part of something meaningful. I'd always introduced myself as Adam Thompson from Thompson's Auto Service, caring for a family tradition that meant something in our community. Now I was just Adam, unemployed mechanic with no prospects and a rapidly approaching deadline for making rent. The future that had seemed so secure just months ago had evaporated like steam from an overheated radiator. I thought about calling my father's old friends, the customers who'd known me since I was a kid, but pride kept me from reaching out. What would I say? That I'd been fired from my own inheritance for showing kindness to an old veteran? That the business they'd trusted for generations was now being run by people who saw them as nothing more than walking ATM machines? The worst part wasn't the financial stress or even the professional humiliation. The worst part was a growing suspicion that maybe I'd been living in a fantasy world all along. Maybe the values my father had taught me about treating people right and building relationships based on trust were just quaint relics of a simpler time that had no place in modern business. Maybe Laura and Blake were the realists, and I was just a small-town idealist who'd never learned how the world actually worked. Maybe getting fired was the universe's way of telling me to grow up and face reality instead of clinging to outdated notions about integrity and community. As I sat there in the growing darkness of my empty apartment, I realized I was facing a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could either adapt to the way things apparently were, or I could hold on to principles that had got me into this mess and hope that somehow, somewhere, there were still people who valued the same things I did. The phone was silent. The job prospects were non-existent. The bank account was nearly empty. And for the first time in my adult life, I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. Rock bottom, it turns out, is a surprisingly quiet place. But sometimes, when you've lost everything you thought you wanted, you finally get the chance to discover what you actually need. I just had to survive long enough to find out what that was. The phone rang on the day my rent was due. I was sitting on my second-hand couch, staring at the stack of bills on my coffee table like they might magically transform into lottery tickets if I looked at them hard enough. The walls of my tiny apartment seemed to be closing in, and I felt like I was watching my life circle the drain in slow motion. Unknown number. My heart jumped. Maybe it was finally a call back from one of the dozens of places I'd applied to. Maybe someone, somewhere, needed a mechanic who still believed in doing things the right way. The voice on the other end was one I'd almost forgotten but recognized immediately. John, the old veteran with the Ford pickup and the patient Labrador. He told me he'd gone back to the shop to bring me that honey he promised, just like he said he would. The thought of someone actually keeping their word in this mess of broken promises was almost overwhelming. But what he learned there hit me like a punch to the gut and a warm hug at the same time. One of the mechanics had told him what happened, how I'd gotten fired for helping him out, how my simple act of basic human decency had cost me my job at my own family's business. John had asked around, got my number, and decided to reach out. In that moment, sitting in my empty apartment with my future hanging by a thread, hearing the voice of this near stranger who'd taken the time to check on me, well, it felt like a ray of sunlight breaking through the darkest storm clouds I'd ever seen. There's something profound about discovering that kindness actually does come back to you, even when you're convinced the universe has forgotten your address. We agreed to meet at Mel's Diner, the kind of small-town cafe where the coffee's strong enough to wake the dead, and the pie tastes like someone's grandmother made it with love instead of preservatives. The place smelled like fresh coffee and old wood, worn smooth by decades of honest conversations between working people. John was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his faithful dog lying quietly beside him. The Labrador looked up when I approached, tail wagging just enough to be polite without being pushy. Even the dog had better social skills than most people I knew. I slid into the booth across from John and found myself doing something I hadn't done in months. Talking freely to another human being without calculating every word for maximum survival value. Maybe it was the way John listened without judgment, or maybe I just reached the breaking point where keeping everything bottled up was no longer an option. Either way, the whole story came pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. I told him about Laura slithering into our lives, about watching my father get manipulated by someone who saw opportunity where he saw love. I explained the devastating reading, the hostile takeover of everything my family had built, and the systematic corruption of values that had taken 3 generations to establish. John sat there through it all, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, but mostly just being present in a way that reminded me what genuine human connection felt like. His eyes held compassion without pity, understanding without judgment. When I finished my sad tale, John was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and looking out the window at the passing traffic. I could almost see him processing everything I'd told him, weighing it against his own experiences, and coming to conclusions I couldn't yet imagine. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said something that changed the entire trajectory of my life. He lived alone on a farm about 40 miles outside town, had some beehives, a decent-sized property, and more work than one aging veteran could reasonably handle by himself. He needed help with general maintenance, farm work, and managing the bees. In exchange, he could offer room, board, and a chance to learn skills that might open doors I hadn't even considered. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. Here was this man I'd known for maybe 15 minutes total, offering to take a complete stranger into his home based on nothing more than a moment of kindness and a sad story over coffee. It was either the most naive thing I'd ever heard, or the most profound act of faith in human nature I'd ever witnessed. I looked across the table at John's weathered face, at the calm certainty in his eyes, and realized I was seeing something I'd started to believe didn't exist anymore. Genuine goodness without an agenda. He wasn't offering to help me because he expected something in return or because it would benefit him somehow. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. The decision was easier than I'd expected. What did I have to lose? My thriving career? My stable living situation? My bright prospects of the future? I was already at rock bottom. The only direction left was up. 2 hours later, we were caravanning in our vehicles toward what John called home, and I was calling my last chance at a fresh start. My entire life fit into the back of my pickup truck, a sobering reminder of how quickly everything you think is permanent can disappear. The drive gave me time to think about the strangeness of the situation. This morning I'd been an unemployed mechanic facing homelessness, and now I was following a virtual stranger to a farm where I'd be learning about beekeeping and agricultural life. If someone had told me this story, I'd have suggested they lay off the science fiction novels. But as the miles rolled by and the urban sprawl gave way to rolling countryside, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months' hope. Maybe this was what rock bottom was supposed to teach you, that when you lose everything you thought you needed, you might discover what you actually need. John's farm was like stepping into a different world, one where time moved at the pace of seasons instead of quarterly profit reports. The farmhouse was old but solid, built by people who understood that things were meant to last. It needed work, fresh paint, some roof repairs, general maintenance that accumulates when one person tries to manage more property than they reasonably can. But it felt real in a way that nothing had felt real for months. Honest work, honest land, honest relationships with neighbors who measured success by different standards than the ones that had destroyed my family's business. John showed me to a room on the second floor that was bigger than my entire apartment had been. Clean, simple, with windows that looked out over fields that stretched to the horizon. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I had space to breathe. The beehives were like nothing I'd ever experienced. 10 wooden boxes arranged in a neat row, each one home to thousands of bees working together with efficiency that would make any management consultant weep with envy. John explained the basics, how the colonies functioned, how to harvest honey without destroying the ecosystem, how to read the signs that indicated whether a hive was healthy or struggling. It was like learning a completely different language, one based on observation and patience rather than immediate results and instant gratification. The bees didn't care about quarterly earnings or market share. They just focused on doing their work and taking care of their community. We started selling honey at the local farmers market, and I was amazed at how different it felt to offer people something that was genuinely good for them instead of try to extract maximum profit from every interaction. Customers would come back week after week, bringing their friends, building relationships based on trust and quality rather than aggressive sales tactics. In the evenings, John would share stories from his past as military service, his years working with government agencies training dogs for specialized tasks, the unique methods he developed for teaching animals complex behaviors. His dog, it turned out, was a graduate of his own training program, capable of tasks that seemed almost supernatural to someone who'd never seen that level of animal intelligence. John had spent decades refining techniques for training dogs for law enforcement, search and rescue, and therapy work. He developed his own approach that emphasized building relationships rather than simply commanding obedience. Watching him work with his dog was like observing a master craftsman who'd spent a lifetime perfecting his art. The most profound thing John taught me wasn't about bees or farming or even dog training. It was a perspective on life that became my new philosophy. Life isn't about how much you've lost. It's about how much you can create with what remains. That simple statement reframed everything I had been through. Instead of seeing myself as a victim of circumstances beyond my control, I started thinking about what I could build with the skills, experiences, and values I still possessed. This wasn't just a temporary sanctuary while I figure out my next move. This was an incubator for a completely different way of living, working, and relating to other people. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was actually starting to thrive. The work was physical and demanding, but it felt meaningful in a way that nothing had felt meaningful since before Laura entered our lives. Every fence post I replaced, every hive I tended, every jar of honey we sold represented something real and valuable being created rather than extracted. As autumn approached and the leaves started changing colors, I realized I had found something I hadn't even known I was looking for, a sense of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation. Sometimes the best doors are the ones you never thought to knock on, and sometimes the most important journeys begin when you finally stop trying to go back to where you came from and start paying attention to where you actually are. 6 months on John's farm flew by like pages in a good book. Before you know it, you're deep into a story you never want to end. Life had found its rhythm. Morning coffee watching the sunrise over fields that seemed to stretch forever, afternoons with the bees humming their ancient songs, evenings at the farmer's market where people actually knew your name and cared about your honey. I was healing in ways I didn't even know I was broken. Sleep came easier. Food tasted better. Hell, even my reflection in the mirror looked like someone I might actually want to hang out with. Then John's dog decided to surprise us all by having puppies. 3 little golden tornadoes that turned our peaceful farm into what can only be described as controlled chaos with occasional moments of pure magic. I volunteered to be the primary puppy wrangler, partly because John's back wasn't what it used to be, and partly because there's something about baby animals that reminds you what joy actually feels like. These weren't just pets. They were therapy on 4 legs, demanding nothing but attention and giving back unconditional love in return. I was in the middle of what I'd started calling puppy meditation, basically sitting very still while 3 fuzzballs climbed all over me like I was their personal jungle gym, when I heard a car crunching up the gravel driveway. Looking up from my position as human dog toy, I saw a Honda Civic that had clearly seen some miles but was well maintained. The kind of car driven by someone who understood that reliability mattered more than impressing strangers. The woman who stepped out looked like she'd walked straight out of one of those commercials where everyone's having way too much fun doing ordinary things. Not perfect in that artificial way that makes you suspicious, but real pretty, if you know what I mean. The kind of beautiful that comes from being comfortable in your own skin. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore jeans that had actually been worked in, and when she smiled at the sight of me covered in puppies, I felt something click into place that I hadn't even realized was broken. John emerged from the house with the biggest grin I'd seen on his face since I'd arrived. He introduced her as Sarah, his granddaughter, home from veterinary school for what he called a sanity break, before final year. "Grandpa always said you were a lifesaver," she said, extending a hand that was firm and warm. But he didn't mention you came with your own pack of assistants. The moment Sarah crouched down to meet the puppies, something magical happened. These little chaos agents who'd been treating me like a human chew toy suddenly transformed into perfect angels. They sat, they stayed. They probably would have filed her taxes if she'd asked. Turns out Sarah had been helping John develop his training methods since she was in high school. Watching her work was like seeing someone speak a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. She'd make these subtle gestures, barely audible sounds, and the puppies would respond like she was conducting an orchestra. How the hell do you do that? I asked, genuinely amazed as she got all 3 puppies to sit in a perfect line. Her laugh was the kind that made you want to hear it again. Same way you probably diagnose engine problems. Pattern recognition, patience, and understanding that everything has its own logic once you figure out the system. We started spending every spare moment together, and I mean that in the least creepy way possible. John needed help with the expansion he'd been planning for the hives. The farmer's market booth required 2 people to run efficiently, and those puppies weren't going to train themselves. But if I'm being honest, I would have found excuses to hang around even if there hadn't been legitimate work to do. Sarah had this way of seeing the world that made everything seem more interesting. She'd point out things I'd never noticed. The way the bees communicated through dancing, how the puppies were already establishing their pack hierarchy, why certain plants thrived in John's garden while others struggled. Evenings became my favorite time of day. We'd sit by the old farm pond, sometimes talking for hours about everything from her veterinary studies to my mechanical background, sometimes just enjoying the kind of comfortable silence that only happens when you found someone who doesn't require constant entertainment. The puppies became our shared project, and watching Sarah work with them was better than any movie I'd ever seen. She had this theory that training was really about building relationships rather than enforcing obedience, and the results were incredible. These weren't just well-behaved dogs. They were partners, teammates, little furry colleagues who seemed to genuinely enjoy learning new things. Most people try to dominate animals, she explained one evening as we watched the puppies practice their recall training. But that's like trying to have a conversation by shouting. Sure, you might get compliance, but you'll never get cooperation. I found myself falling for her in ways that probably would have been embarrassing if she hadn't been falling right back. There's something profound about finding someone who challenges you to be better while accepting exactly who you are right now. The night I kissed her, we'd been sitting by the pond talking about our respective disasters. Her stress about veterinary school, my complete life implosion courtesy of Laura and Blake. The conversation had gotten serious, then funny, then serious again, and somewhere in there, I realized I was looking at someone I want to build a future with. You know what's weird? I said, reaching for her hand. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. She squeezed my fingers and looked at me with an expression that was part amusement, part affection, and part something deeper that made my heart do things hearts aren't supposed to do. Maybe your life wasn't over. Maybe it was just getting started. That's when I kissed her, right there under stars that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. It was one of those perfect moments that you know you'll remember when you're 90, the kind that makes you believe in things like destiny and second chances. John watched our budding romance with the satisfaction of a chess master who'd seen checkmate coming 20 moves ahead. He'd make comments about good hearts finding each other, and generally acted like he'd personally arranged the whole thing through some combination of divine intervention and superior matchmaking skills. 3 weeks into what we were calling the Puppy Project, Sarah dropped a bomb that changed everything. What if we turned this into a real business? She asked one morning over coffee, gesturing toward the puppies who were demonstrating their latest tricks for anyone willing to watch. I've been researching the market for professionally trained service dogs, and the numbers are insane. She pulled out her laptop and showed me websites where fully trained dogs were selling for $15,000, $20,000, even $50,000. Therapy dogs, PTSD service animals, mobility assistance dogs, search and rescue specialists. There was an entire economy of highly trained animals helping people live better lives. We've got everything we need, she continued, getting that excited gleam in her eye that I was already learning meant she'd had another brilliant idea. 3 puppies with perfect temperaments, a master trainer who spent 40 years perfecting his methods, a vet student who understands animal behavior, and a guy with business experience who knows how to make things actually work. John was immediately on board. He'd been developing training techniques for decades, but had never had the right combination of circumstances to scale them up. Now he had young energy to handle the physical demands, educated minds to tackle the business challenges, and enough motivation to make it actually succeed. I registered the business that week, Heritage Farm Training Center. The name felt right, honoring John's legacy, acknowledging the farm's history, and representing the kind of values-based approach we wanted to build our reputation on. Sarah handled marketing and social media, while John developed our curriculum, and I managed the administrative nightmare of becoming a legitimate business entity. Sarah's Instagram videos of our training sessions went viral in the specialized communities we were targeting. Veterans organizations started sharing our content. Professional dog trainers reached out wanting to learn John's methods. Within a month, we had a waiting list of potential clients and more business opportunities than we knew how to handle. Our first major break came when a representative from a federal veterans rehabilitation program saw our videos and offered us a pilot contract. 12 dogs, 6 months of training, specialized PTSD support protocols. The kind of opportunity that could either establish our reputation or destroy it if we screwed up. We didn't screw up. Our dogs exceeded every performance metric, and the feedback from the veterans was the kind of testimonials you can't buy with any amount of marketing budget. Real people talking about how our animals had given them their lives back. The contracts that followed that first success were bigger, more complex, and more rewarding than anything I'd ever worked on. Federal law enforcement agencies, search and rescue organizations, therapy programs for children with autism. We weren't just training dogs. We were creating partnerships that save lives and change communities. By the end of our first year, we'd grossed $150,000 and established relationships with organizations across 3 states. Sarah had deferred her final year of veterinary school to focus on our expansion, and John was having the time of his life teaching his methods to a new generation of trainers. I proposed to Sarah on the 1-year anniversary of our first kiss, right there by the pond where everything had started. I'd planned this elaborate speech about love and partnership and building something beautiful together, but when the moment came, all I could manage was asking if she wanted to make this partnership official. She said yes before I'd even finished the question, and we had our wedding right there on the farm 6 months later. John officiated. Our dog served as the wedding party, and half the county showed up to celebrate with us under stars that seemed to approve of the whole arrangement. John gave us the farm as a wedding gift, saying he couldn't think of a better way to ensure his legacy would continue. A year later, Sarah and I welcomed our son into the world, and John transformed into the most devoted grandfather in the history of grandfathers, spending hours teaching him about bees and dogs and the importance of treating every living creature with respect. By year 3, we'd signed our biggest contract yet, $1.8 million to train specialized working dogs for federal agencies. We were employing 15 people, operating out of a purpose-built facility, and getting recognition from professional organizations we'd never dreamed of working with. Success, when it's built on values you're proud of rather than schemes you have to hide, feels different. Every dollar we earned represented someone's life getting measurably better. Every relationship we built was based on delivering real value rather than extracting maximum profit. Which brings me to the sweet part of the story, the part where karma finally comes around to collect on some old debts. Business took me back to my hometown for the first time since everything had fallen apart. I was there to meet with a potential client, but curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to drive by Thompson's Auto Service to see how the place was doing under new management. Except there was no Thompson's Auto Service anymore. In its place stood a Dollar General, the kind of generic chain store that could have been anywhere in America. I parked across the street and stared at the spot where 3 generations of my family had built something that mattered, now reduced to another forgettable retail space. The teenager working the register was happy to chat about local history when I asked about the auto shop that used to be there. Turns out it closed 3 years earlier amid what he described as a whole bunch of drama. Customer complaints, fraud investigations, the kind of business disaster that leaves lawyers excited and everyone else disgusted. I drove by my childhood home and found a young family living there. When I knocked on the door and introduced myself as someone who'd grown up there, they invited Sarah and me in for coffee and told us their story. Turns out they bought the house directly from Laura a few years back, and she'd been in such a hurry to leave town that they'd gotten it for well below market value. The husband mentioned that the previous owner seemed desperate to sell quickly and move away, something about too much bad history in this place. They'd restored the wraparound porch, planted flowers in my mother's old garden beds, and generally returned the place to the kind of home it had been designed to be. Their toddler was playing with wooden blocks in the same living room where I'd done homework, and the sound of genuine laughter-filled spaces that had been tense and uncomfortable during Laura's reign. Driving home that evening, with Sarah beside me and our son sleeping in his car seat, I realized something profound about the nature of success and revenge and what actually matters in life. Laura and Blake had won the battle for my father's assets, but they'd lost the war for everything that made those assets valuable in the first place. They'd inherited money and property, but they destroyed the relationships and reputation that gave those things meaning. Meanwhile, I'd found something more valuable than anything they could have stolen from me. Real family, meaningful work, the kind of success that doesn't require stepping on other people to achieve. As we pulled into our driveway, past a sign that read Heritage Farm Training Center, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you found your place in the world. Not the place you thought you wanted, but the place you were actually meant to be. That night, as I tucked our son into bed and listened to Sarah planning our next expansion over baby monitor static, I whispered a quiet thank you to Universe for teaching me that lesson the hard way, because the easy way never would have led me here, to this farm, this family, this life that feels like the best story I never could have written for myself. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is forcing you to discover just how strong and creative and resilient you really are when you stop depending on them for your sense of worth. Life isn't about clinging to the past or seeking revenge on people who wronged you. It's about having the wisdom to recognize when losing everything you thought you wanted was actually the first step toward finding everything you actually needed. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best revenge is living so well that the people who hurt you become completely irrelevant to your happiness.